Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6. This editorial is related to the latest Naxal attack that took place in Chhattisgarh. In this brutal act of violence, a group of Naxals ambushed a large contingent of security forces from the state police and as well as from the CRPF's elite Cobra unit. The security forces were conducting a massive combing operation and they were leading area domination patrols in the Naxal hit areas. These combing exercises had been planned in Bijapur and Sukma districts of Chhattisgarh in order to deter the Maoists who had been holding up the construction of a critical road in the region. In the remote areas of Chhattisgarh, such as the Sukma district, the Maoists tend to use the terrain to their advantage and hence they oppose any road and communication project in line with the principles of the Maoist doctrine. So while the security forces were conducting these patrols in the Maoist dominated areas, they came under an ambush attack, resulting in the death of more than 20 security personnel, and the editorial terms this attack as an act of mindless violence, and it points out that the latest attack in Chhattisgarh clearly indicates that even though Maoists are on the decline in the country, and even though their insurgent capabilities have been weakened, they still pose a credible threat to India's internal security, especially because of their formidable presence in the southern parts of Chhattisgarh. See, Maoist violence reared its ugly head for the first time in India in the year 1967 in a small village known as Naxalbari in West Bengal, which is located near the Siliguri corridor. In the Naxalbari village, the peasants they rose up in a violent rebellion against the landlords and against the feudal society, and this led to the emergence of Maoist movement or Naxal movement in the country. These left-wing extremists, inspired by Maoist ideology, they have primarily focused on the peasants, the tribal communities, farmers, workers, and other lower classes of the society to instigate an armed rebellion against the state. They have built their movement by basing it on two key pillars, which is to highlight the failure of governance and the lack of development in remote areas and the repression of the weaker sections by the state. Based on these genuine grievances, the left-wing extremists of India have propagated Maoist principles and Maoist ideology in the country, and over the last 6 decades, their violent struggle against the Indian state remains a credible internal security threat for India. As per Mao Zedong's doctrine, the Naxals in India have called for an armed struggle against the Indian state in order to capture state power by overthrowing the government, and they are focused on creating mass mobilization through effective communication and propaganda of their ideology and objectives. And as suggested by Mao Zedong, they have based their armed struggle by exploiting the local terrain and the local geography to their advantage. And they have specialized in carrying out ambush attacks through their guerrilla and jungle warfare techniques. Since the primary objective of Maoist insurgency is to throw out the state and capture state power, their armed struggle is focused on targeting anything that represents the government. This includes the security forces and as well as the local police stations and the civilian administration. They even target any government infrastructure, including roads, mobile towers, bridges, schools, water tanks, etc., because their ideology will remain valid and legitimate only as long as they are able to prove to the local people that the government has failed to provide for adequate development, and by showing that the state is a repressing force which stamps down on the rights of the weaker sections such as peasants, tribal communities, farmers, and workers. Through such careful propaganda and indoctrination, the Maoists managed to build a movement which was initially centered around Bihar and West Bengal back in the 1970s. By 1980s, different Maoist groups began emerging in various parts of India, including in Andhra Pradesh. Slowly, these Maoists extended their influence across central and eastern parts of India, covering the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Telangana. For several decades, they even managed to have influence in few pockets of Western Ghats in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. But by 1990s, the Indian government, along with the states, started countering Naxal violence quite effectively through security operations. And especially the state of Andhra, the Andhra State Police established a dedicated special force known as the Grey Hounds, which specialized in guerrilla warfare and jungle warfare tactics. Through such effective police action, Andhra Pradesh succeeded in almost wiping out Naxalism in the state, and by late 1990s, the Naxal movement had even started declining in the Bihar West Bengal belt. As the Maoist groups were slowly losing their influence, a major development took place in 2004 when the Communist Party of India Maoist was established with the merger of the Maoist Communist Center of India and the People's War Group. These two Maoist outfits had been sufficiently weakened by the state's security response, but following their merger into one single organization, they again re-emerged as a credible security threat, and they significantly expanded their presence across central, eastern and southern parts of India. This corridor popularly came to be known as the Naxal Corridor or the Red Corridor, and by 2006-2007, this outfit had centered its operations around this belt. By this period, it emerged as a grave internal security threat for the country, and the then Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, rightly pointed out that left-wing extremism happens to be the biggest security threat for India. By 2007, the Naxal corridor had expanded considerably in its presence and influence, and according to the Home Ministry, more than 180 districts in the country were under the influence of Naxals out of the total 600 plus districts. So roughly 33% of the country was under Naxal influence, and many of these districts, at least 50 to 60 districts, had seen the emergence of parallel governments being run by the Naxals. So essentially in these core areas, the civilian administration had been pushed out, and the Naxals were referring to these districts as liberated areas. The Naxal influence had even spread to a few industrial centers as well in and around Delhi, and nearly a decade ago, the Naxal threat was clearly India's biggest internal security threat. Especially from 2009-2010 onwards, in and around Chhattisgarh and Odisha, the Naxal outfit started carrying out major attacks against the security forces. And in the Bastar district alone, more than 175 security personnel have been killed by the Naxals. Following this sudden rise in Naxal violence in the country, the government of India woke up to the threat and started proactively working with the state governments. Then we witnessed the emergence of a new thinking within the government, wherein the government finally started acknowledging the governance deficit in these areas, which had primarily contributed to the rise of Naxal ideology. Once the development divide and governance deficit was acknowledged by the government, then it became easier to craft a well-designed strategy to counter the Naxals. Accordingly, the central government came out with a two-pronged strategy by working with the state governments, and it was driven by effective security operations, that is counter-insurgency operations on one side, while bridging the development deficit or the governance deficit on the other side. So the center, along with the states, they began working together on development projects that were exclusively focused on the Naxal hit districts. And several development projects, such as Integrated Action Plan, was launched to bridge the governance gap in these areas. In this development agenda, the local administration, that is the district administration, was roped in, and through better decentralization, greater powers were given to the district officials to focus on the critical needs of these districts in order to improve their development indicators. Parallelly, the state police forces were being modernized with the help of the central government under schemes such as the SRE or the Security Related Expenditure Scheme. And the center started supplementing the resources of the state police forces. And as a result, a series of dedicated counter-insurgency operations began from 2009 onwards, which was unofficially codenamed as Operation Green Hunt. Then the other states, they learned from the example of Andhra Pradesh and its success with regard to the Grey Hounds, and similar special forces were created by most of the state governments. Jharkhand, West Bengal, Maharashtra, and even Telangana and Madhya Pradesh adopted similar strategies, and they worked closely with the center to focus not just on development but also to conduct effective security operations. As a result of this twin strategy, India achieved remarkable success against the Naxals, and by 2017-2019, the Naxal influence has been remarkably reduced, and today their influence is limited to hardly around 70 to 80 districts in the country. The state governments of West Bengal, Bihar, even Jharkhand, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, they have all managed to push back the Naxals by countering their ideology with better development and as well as by inflicting heavy losses on them through effective security operations. In southern Indian states as well, the base for Naxalism has been wiped out, and as a result, the Red Corridor has shrunk significantly over the years. But just when we were about to assume that the Maoist threat was almost over, this insurgent outfit manages to strike back, especially in southern parts of Chhattisgarh and in few pockets of Odisha. And this shows that even though the Maoists have been considerably weakened in the country, and even though their top leadership has been largely neutralized, they still manage to pose a credible threat to India's internal security because of their formidable presence in South Chhattisgarh. The PLGA, the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army, which is the armed wing of the Indian Naxal movement, that is the CPI Maoist, has been deliberately scaling up violence in order to revive the declining movement. These attacks are designed to re-establish the presence of the Naxals, and such large-scale attacks on security forces are deliberately carried out to invite state repression, because when the state forces respond to these attacks violently, there could be some collateral damage in the form of repression of the local communities and the violation of their rights by the security forces, which in turn makes these victims of state violence the right candidates for recruitment and indoctrination, which is needed to revive and renew the movement. Right now, the response of the Indian state is more mature, and India realizes that a military solution alone cannot win this conflict for us. Because this deep-rooted conflict is indeed based on certain genuine grievances and root causes, which is essentially the lack of development and the failure of governance in the tribal areas and the remote areas. But several states have learned this lesson and they have worked closely with the center to address both the security and development divides. But however, Chhattisgarh stands out as a failure in this regard. Compared to other states such as West Bengal, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh, even Maharashtra, the state government of Chhattisgarh has hardly done anything to address the governance deficit, and it has failed to reach out to the tribal communities. Then upon this, the state police of Chhattisgarh has failed to devise an effective security response, and especially Naxal strongholds such as Bijapur, Sukma, Bastar and Dantewada, the state forces have failed to regain their lost ground. Because see, when it comes to such counterinsurgency operations in remote hinterlands, no matter how many central forces you deploy, there will always be outside forces, and they can never be as effective as the local forces against these insurgents. Around the world, our experience in counterinsurgency shows that if you have to defeat and wipe out such deep-rooted movements, then you need local forces which are well versed with local terrain. And as the local forces have higher motivation and higher stakes in this conflict, they should be given ample resources to fight back effectively against the insurgents. Yes, the outside forces, such as central forces, can supplement the resources, but they cannot lead this fight. And no matter how well equipped they are, and no matter how well trained they are, they always have limitations when it comes to such local insurgencies. In this regard, Chhattisgarh has failed because if you look at other states, such as Andhra Pradesh, they achieved remarkable success against the Naxals because of the local security response by the state police. So keeping these factors in mind, the government of India should push towards a long-lasting solution, which will be based on three key pillars. First and foremost, the government of India should show its openness and willingness to engage the Naxals in a dialogue, because currently the Naxals are in a considerably weaker position. If talks and negotiations take place, then the government would be negotiating from the position of strength. and such a dialogue can facilitate a political solution to this conflict. Then parallelly, we shouldn't lose our focus on development, especially grassroots development. And while the first two approaches are being followed up, there has to be consistent pressure being exerted on the Naxals by the security forces as well. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which evaluates the advantages of opening up virtual access to the Supreme Court. See, the pandemic and the lockdown pushed the judiciary as well to adopt the mode of remote working for the sake of physical distancing. The writer says that these virtual hearings have come as a blessing as it has made it easier for anyone in the country to access the Supreme Court because virtual hearings overcome the geographical constraints of accessing the Supreme Court when it is located in a permanent fixed location. See, when the Constitution was being drafted, there were several debates within the Constituent Assembly that expressed concern with regard to the issue of geographical access to the Supreme Court. During these debates, the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, insisted that the Supreme Court should be given a permanent fixed location, that is in the national capital, because the litigants, they should know where to go and whom to approach for protecting their constitutional rights. But at the same time, the framers of the Constitution, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, they agreed that the huge volume of litigation that might come in from different parts of the country may require the Supreme Court to increase its reach and access and hold the sittings elsewhere as well. So to facilitate such hearings of the Supreme Court in different locations, the Constitution provided for the establishment of circuit benches outside Delhi as well. And this decision to open up circuit benches was left to the discretion of the Chief Justice of India. But unfortunately, despite repeated appeals over the decades, and despite the increasing caseload and backlogs at the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of India has never allowed for the establishment of circuit benches. This, according to the writer, has hindered justice because the geographical constraint with regard to accessing the Supreme Court becomes a huge burden on the litigant. There are various studies that have shown that most of the cases of the Supreme Court, they are coming in from high courts that are located closer to Delhi. Research shows that a disproportionately high number of cases filed in the Supreme Court, they are originating from high courts that are situated closer to Delhi. This indicates that those who are closer to Delhi, they prefer to file appeals to the Supreme Court and approach the Supreme Court for justice because it is much more easier for them to access the Supreme Court both with regard to cost and the availability of lawyers. But from far off states, it may not be feasible for everyone to afford these higher costs, and upon that, they will even face difficulties in hiring local lawyers. These geographical constraints with regard to the access of the Supreme Court means that accessing the higher judiciary has become the domain of a select few lawyers and individuals, and this exclusivity translates into higher monetary cost for the litigants. Litigants from outside of Delhi, they often find it very difficult to seek the right kind of legal help from lawyers because they won't be able to take their lawyers to Delhi due to the higher costs, and their only option would be to hire local lawyers in Delhi itself. And in most cases, litigants who can't find local lawyers in Delhi, they are forced to choose from those lawyers who are offered by the Bar Association in Delhi. This significantly affects the quality of legal aid being offered to them, and it also increases the cost of accessing justice. So the writer says that the pandemic has come as a blessing because this is what pushed the Supreme Court to finally adopt virtual hearings. And today, the widespread usage of virtual hearings has opened up the Supreme Court to litigants from around the country. But the writer acknowledges that this may not be the perfect alternative to circuit benches, which has been mandated in the Constitution. But until the Supreme Court does something about this, and until the Chief Justice of India listens to the recommendations of various law commissions and parliamentary committees, virtual hearings will be the most viable alternative because it widens the access to Supreme Court and as well as makes it easier to access free and unhindered justice. Next, in a column on page number 7, India's former Foreign Secretary, Krishnan Srinivasan, illustrates the economic dependency of US and China despite their ongoing Cold War. Over the last 2 decades, the rapid rise of China, both in economic terms and military terms, has pitted China as the main rival of the United States. Until recently, the United States was comfortably enjoying the tag of being the sole superpower, but now all of a sudden it faces a formidable challenge in the form of China. So, this automatically leads to a strategic, economic, diplomatic, and military competition and confrontation between these two superpowers, which are vying for global domination. The emergence of this new Cold War, or the so called Cold War 2.0, is filled with rhetoric, accusations, and blames against each other, thereby resulting in the direct rise of tensions between the two sides. This was very evident at the latest Alaska meet between US and China, where both the sides levied accusations against each other. The US primarily targets China on the question of human rights and violation of human rights in Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and it also calls out China's military aggression in the South China Sea and its blatant violation of the rules based order. China counters these allegations of the United States by referring to the US as a hegemonic power and a bully, which is still stuck with a colonial and imperial mindset. Such open exchange of accusations and blames against each other has resulted in trade wars. They have even gone to the extent of imposing sanctions on each other, and they are in the process of building up their military capabilities targeted at each other, followed by the formation of diplomatic clubs and diplomatic groupings designed to counter the influence of the other. One such example would be the quadrilateral being pushed by the US as a diplomatic counter to China and its influence in the Indo Pacific. This confrontation and competition between the two superpowers also translates to intense competition at several global institutions, and hence, if the World Bank and the IMF are dominated by the US and the Western countries, China is in the process of creating successful alternatives such as the SCO or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the New Development Bank under BRICS, and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. But the writer points out that despite all this rhetoric and despite the ongoing confrontation and competition, these two countries cannot deny the fact that they are excessively dependent on each other, especially in the economic domain. US and China both realize that they need each other very much with regard to global stability, especially on issues related to Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea, Myanmar, etc. They know for a fact that they have to work with each other on key global issues such as climate change, cybersecurity, healthcare, clean and renewable forms of energy, etc. Their economies are so intertwined that there exists a strong interconnection between their supply chains, and they are critical for each other to trigger economic growth in their respective countries and to create jobs and employment opportunities. They also depend on each other for critical investments in services and manufacturing, and even their technology industry, especially emerging technologies, are interdependent on each other. While the two governments are aware of this interdependency, they still continue to engage in such open rhetoric and confrontation, largely to please their domestic audience. So the writer concludes that this so called Cold War is going to continue between US and China for the coming years, or maybe even for the coming decades. But all the while, they will know the cost of conflict because they understand the extent of each other's mutual dependency. Next, on page number 6, we have another column which explains how in a post-pandemic world, inequality is going to rise, and addressing this inequality is going to be the key to sustaining growth and well-being around the world, especially in developing countries like India. But this is a discussion that we have had repeatedly over the last few months, so I request you to go through this column once. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: latest Naxal violence in Chhattisgarh indicates that, though weakened, Maoists still remain a strong military threat. Evaluate. The second question: access to the Supreme Court has been made easier with virtual hearings. but more needs to be done to secure free and unhindered justice. Analyze the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.